Hello everyone, today for our Eurasian Steppes Warfare we discuss the so-called hard century, the 13th, right? Observing some, say, aspects that we have actually already widely discussed in other videos outside of the series actually. Just recently, for example, one about the Mongol heavy cavalrymen, but there is plenty of that, especially about Mongol warfare, but also about Rus warfare. We, generally speaking, introduced the Kumans, right? And there is a lot there, of course, to unveil, to examine. We never, for example, ever made a battle video yet about the either Kalka River, Mohi, Lenitsa, etc. But there is more to that. You know, they started a Chinese warfare series from the year before the last, right? So there is all something that we have to thicken the net of in order to get more properly, and I hope to be up to it in the following years' time, and energies allowing. But I really count on it. As you know, I'm passionate about my work, and I look forward to expand always my knowledge, or actually just deepen it further, because it's the same thing really, about things we have partly already seen about medieval warfare. But there are certain topics that deserve also a bit of brainstorming and broader critique, right? For example, last autumn I made that video about why the Mongols, even if they had wanted to, could have never conquered Europe. That became algorithmic, and I was, amused by that, because I know it's a bit of a provoking title, and the content is up to that, without, I hope, any partisan consideration there. But I really like studying steppes warfare. Has helped me dimensioning much better what properly sedentary civilizations are made of, and how we constantly discredit it because it's normal, right? Discredit them instinctively, right? On average, like, this is the entire point of tradition that people coming on my channel never understand, right? Many people understand my channel as a sort of say just mystical barbarian kind of exaltation against what I don't know why. I know why actually. There is all this hatred towards civilization, because it is exactly what tradition explained per se. It's probably the human failure in the incapacity of obtaining what civilizations actually do in terms of sheer power. And so there is always the need of denigration, of pretending that, I don't know, there is some terrible condition in civilizations that make it so bad to live in, and that the peoples outside are pure and free, and there is a value in being what exactly? Poor, right? Constantly in peril, disorganized, illiterate, still essentially depending, revolving, and gravitating on the sedentary civilizations that are the thing that you're always looking at, to try to get in. And I've stopped making kind of theoretical videos about this, that before I stopped reflecting much more, not just theoretically, but of course on the basis of what we look at historically, and that now, instead of being pouring just a lot of history videos without any personal criticism or consideration, it's the same me, because whenever I make this recordings, I of course do not behave or speak or just treat these topics in the same way I normally do that, like if I have to teach like a class, or have to speak at a conference, or write an article, or whatever, because it's something else. But at the same time, when you do this thing over and over again, and you start looking at different things at once, you get something that just to respond someone that asks me every once in a while, right? What do you think about history? The deeper meaning of that, like how should we start? It's all about this. It's about the never-ending character of it. It's not really talking too much about what a scholar said, but actually getting, first of all, to the sources. You should look at both in parallel. That it really gets down to your own actual practical deal of what history in measure is. Like, all young people are extremistic, morally relativistic, somehow iconoclastic, right? So there is all, especially the incoming generations whose future, sorry to say that, is completely fucked up by this point. All this ever greater kind of rage, anger, kind of complexes, problems, for which they want to refuse the meaning, right, of universal tradition, that very often, even when they act as conservatives, they literally do not have the palest idea of what the hell it actually is. And that's why I constantly bombard you with the imperial, ecumenic, Catholic tradition, because if you know the actual etymology and meaning of all these words, right, you should, like, no explanation is required. And I also know that lots of people come on this channel without having watched all the almost 1,800 videos that I accumulated here over the years, and they think that I'm just a random guy speaking, just in part for fun. Yes, I admitted it before, but as if there was, just a matter of the umpteenth person that has an opinion. But it's not quite that, right? I usually do not boast my titles as, which are actually the top ones. So I could easily play that card and say, I have this and that, and not the usual master degree of whatever you think actually makes a culture, a person cultures, but in this way. But I never do that, because I know that that's actually the same point of anti-tradition. That's the same thing of disqualifying hierarchy, authority, order, but the ones that actually work, right? Not the ones that wish for that, because they are just individualistically, instinctively, kind of warrioristically craving for something that they cannot afford because of their, as tradition points out, essentially their moral and scientific inferiority. It's really something that must be cultivated for a very, very long time, and that I'm trying to do. Just for me, Schwerpunkt is just an auxilium to what I do in everyday life. And when I talk, as I was saying already, about the Mongol invasions. And for me, we haven't even scratched the surface at that point. I can't talk about this for hours in a row. But there is, of course, more that, again, deserves an adequate, if anything, strategic analysis, which is often the most skipped one, because admittedly it's also the most difficult to do, right? I specialize in tactics, and that's admittedly easier, but I make these videos also to look at how actually, polities and armies worked on a broader spectrum than just the battlefield, right? And as you know, as a Clausewitzian, I truly believe that, and I see it reconfirmed constantly by history, because that's also actually the Clausewitzian method, war as the just the continuation of war with other means. But there is a need to at least set sometimes like the bigger context, right, as well, because without that you can't even start, right? So I admittedly stopped making also the von Kriege series, which, say, I have stopped currently, but of course I could come up with. I usually don't do it because I think, like, as much as I can pour in historically speaking, given that the von Clausewitz videos are not normally watched like the others, because, again, I suspect that's the only reason that there aren't pictures in them, right? People have actually to think something a bit, even usually, of course, given that I read them, more advanced, even just in what I say, so it becomes too difficult. And that's, again, the measure of failure, and the same reason why, again, those videos on this channel, allegedly, made up of people interested in actual strategic culture, gets deserted when the latter shows up, right? Because they don't even properly get what it is. It's admittedly also my fault, right? I always say that, like, that's the same point of tradition. If you are not able to provide with that context, and that's why I make thousands of videos, you can't quite get to the point either, right? So, of course, we made up to 3/4 of the Fangkrig, and there is still lots of Clausewitzian works actually to corroborate that with, and say just all more advanced criticism. I used to make videos properly about military theory, right? Again, it's not easy for me to speak here because it always feels as if I missed that wall, but at least I get lots of comments like saying, "Oh my God, this is like the best channel I ever keep it on without." And yeah, it's always the struggle between getting a bit more views than the average, which turns out to be actually pretty difficult, especially with the format that I stick to fundamentally. But there is also this constant grind, this constant spiritual preparation, right? A sort of monastic experience for which I have to prepare to say more important things, and I think I need it, right? It couldn't be like just let's start talking about the Fangkrig just out of nothing. We needed to talk about other things to prepare, like to introduce that and so on. Why all this for the Mongol? Like, I never made in the Eurasian Steppes Warfare such an introduction, despite of my tendency to actually make very long introduction, mostly, however, in the other videos, because the range, like, of Mongol invasion, even just we talk about Europe, like today, is so big, right? It encompasses such a vast amount of information that objectively it is really difficult to districate oneself, right? And even making, I don't know, the audience, like in the aforementioned video, actually getting what I mean by something like, for example, that the Mongols could have never conquered Europe, even if they had wanted to, right? Of course, I explained, like, every time I make a video, I do get to the point, right? You may not, because you get bored in between, and so the thing fundamentally doesn't take off. But these reflections are really thought out, right? Some can be more or less scripted, whatever, but they're mostly always improvised, right? There is actually all my videos are improvised. I have a sketch, like on the basis of which I operate, but everything I say is the reflection on the same info that I gather from multiple sources before. I just, in my background, let's say, and that I elaborate while I make the same video. So as I was saying before, you will not be without other videos to compare here, because talking about medieval Rus, talking about Mongol warfare, but even the Lithuanian tribes, or the Polish princedoms, or the Swedish and Hungarian policies, like, you have surely a lot, and generally speaking, in a broader horizon kind of contextualization that, in fact, often refers to in this case, the Mongol influence on all these people's warfare, cultures in general, their policy, and so on. This aspect escapes, generally speaking, the average pop cultural approach. I would say there is a sort of say most kids that I see out there on YouTube come straight from materialistic bias, right? They think that history is basically a sort of political activism in a extremistically ideological sense, and if you're an adult person, you still believe that Marx actually explained, or Marxism, or any other communistic ideology actually explains the world or history, what it is. I don't think you should be actually going out there and pretending to be a historian. At least you may actually easily take a degree, right? I see these things every day, but it doesn't mean that when you speak from certain positions, you are a historian, or you are going to be considered as one, right? And as you know, what I concentrate on mostly is, as a good Clausewitzian again, on moral forces, and especially applying, applying this model, measuring, right, on the base of essentially the magic triad, politics, warfare, and society. What kind of, in fact, moral attitude existed towards these people? So of course, someone would say, well, it's the same because we do think as well that matter influences morals and vice versa. Yeah, but it doesn't get down to that as a paradigmatic criticism, right? If you want to argue that there are poor countries, of course, are weaker in a general level of development, well, you can make the case for that, but it's not always that. It's not paradigmatically that. As I was saying before, yes, barbarism loses on the longer run, right? It can be some people sort of hold out for so long and then eventually succumb to others. And that also may even manage to inflict a heavy blow to another civilization or things like that. But it's also about, again, what that moral background really from the other side really was. Otherwise, you couldn't explain anything. Everything would get to a rigid materialistic determinism for which at some point the world destroys itself, which arguably even in terms of the decline of profit or all these things, but doesn't appear to be there. It's not even just mathematically, right? An affordable model doesn't make any sense, right? It's just crossing out all the things that we do not know about moral forces, literally from a physical point of view, and pretending that nothing else exists. So that if you pretend so, it's just because you believe that there is a magic guy in the sky that operates weirdly, and you're just not as scientifically educated to admit that until something is not proven, doesn't mean that in absolute terms cannot exist, right? You shouldn't behave like, it exists just per se, right? You should at least give yourself a reason. And in any case, it's not even so important, right? Nor it fundamentally affects the way you are also trying to pretend to lecture other people of some sort of, model that you use to interpret history differently from, or at least not emphasizing, of course, the moral capacity that can turn the tide in unexpected moments. And studying steppes warfare is very enlightening, I think, on that, because you do see constantly this gigantic, titanic efforts sort of exploit and major way, the Mongol Empire. But you realize that there is much of civilization behind that as well, and there is constantly a tension that mostly those who are from the other side are a bit soft enough to say, oh my god, now who are these monsters from the end of the world, it's terrible steppes, it's a divine punishment at the same time. But we often forget that behind the for example, the aforementioned battles, difficult defeats in open field, and whatever essentially impressed the Westerners about the Mongols, there was from the other side the recognition of essentially first of all the impossibility of going on, right, with a profitable and at least confident, outlook, right, from the broader picture. Because again, what do you want to get down to, right? Stop at every single castle in Central Europe, besieging it for how do you think, how long can it go? Like, this is not a matter of how you get the means together is how you actually can convince a senator from Central Asia just to hold his ground in such a situation for getting something that he's not, however, capable of living in the first place. And we perfectly know that most of these mechanisms that even brought the Mongols in power in other countries were just essentially a substitution, right? An elite substitution with a temporary military settlement that brought almost immediately to basically arrange your own armed forces on a more sanitary-based model. And specifically one of the local culture. We made lots of videos about the Ilkhanate, for example. But it's not all. What I was referring to before was especially the sense that we have developed as Westerners in their narrower sense. I also checked that box, actually. Essentially eliminating most of Central, particularly Central, but of course, in this case, especially Eastern Europe, depending on which criterion you use. Like Central Europe as this place that could, at that point, properly mix the modernity and the tradition of the whole picture. But Eastern Europe, the ones that were overrun, so which the civilizational dimension fundamentally at least received the hardest blow. And essentially, this is the moment in which Eastern Europe, correctly meant, is born. Right before that, a place like the Rus, for example, were much more like Central Europe. They were much more similar to Poland, for example. The Mongol wave changes everything for good. The Muscovy is born essentially as a copy of a Mongol force, right? And that there is a level that kind of, there is essentially a balance broken there, right? The average per, say, those mercantile estates that had intelligently provoked the Russian principalities and kept standing, albeit with great difficulty, like from both sides, the entire system. After having weakened themselves over time, were properly taken out by the Mongols to never be reformed. Right? If you look at the old Russian Palatinate, so the areas that were kind of more advanced, like in the south, in places like Galicia, whatever, those remain actually dramatically advanced, right, for at least other good almost half of a millennium than places like, I don't know, in fact, the aforementioned Muscovy and so on. And that, what was changed at that point, and then with the crisis of the 14th century, this thing essentially freezing and remaining there as a sort of ancien regime, but the bad one, like the worst one in Europe, right? So the one that properly didn't work because it was dramatically unbalanced in terms of social, divide, to the point that, again, you have a very strong elite, but essentially you do not develop a new wave of new energy. You can at best seize control of certain particular areas, but you have, at the end of the day, the system remaining ever more outdated, hopelessly underdeveloped, and then you must have a revolution, genocide, whatever, because the whole system is just sinking, literally, per se. This thing begins at this time, and very few, I think, realize how deep, right, the cultural divide in Europe really is, also because of the Mongol invasions, right? There is no doubt that there is naturally, an advantage here, that you can argue that even in the previous centuries or millennia, the regions of Western and Southern Europe had been fundamentally spared by the major migratory movements, at least in the destructive nomadic dimension, that instead surely took a massive toll on the development of Central and Eastern Europe. Right? Again, those were not surely areas that could surpass the South at any time. I mean, it hasn't happened yet still, but the question is, they were surely less densely populated. They had poorer communications. Again, in agricultural worlds, generally speaking, right? In a pre-industrial system, temperature does make a difference. But again, these waves of peoples constantly crashing against the Carpathians, the Danubian frontier, the Central Eastern European forest, whatever, are things that hammer impact, also help surely the local peoples to divide. In fact, these populations owe a lot, as I was saying before, in their models of government, even to that kind of autocratic bias in a way. But it's hardly to be seen, I think, at least to be stated, right? In the current, I always call it pop culture. I don't know whether it's the best way to define that, but yes, I mean that both the left and the right do not have, at this point in history, the interest of pointing out this radical, right, cultural difference, because they all try essentially to flatten that divide. In fact, this is exactly how you can measure what happened in the 13th century as well, in reverse, right? As we were saying before, there is a context, and this cannot be ignored, even just per se, or made relative. Right? Again, tons of people tell me, "Oh my God, I come from this place. Thanks for making this video." I do not make videos because of people who come from those places. Hell, I make videos about my own country, about any other. I'm grateful, right, to see you reaching out, saying, "I come from here, from there." But my point is, like, first of all, I couldn't care less in that sense whether who watched the actual video are people from the place where that is discussed in that video. But more generally is, again, the notion that you do not truly understand, and I mean literally anything about your own country. First of all, by having simply born and being raised there, right? It has nothing to do with actually having studied, having a solid, competent understanding of your country's history by any stretch of the imagination, right? Remove that from your mindset. But secondly, that you truly do not know, and will never know anything about your own country until you learn forcefully the history of other countries, because otherwise you cannot give an objective value to your country. It will just be a sort of strange thing floating in a blob of who knows what, right? And you will always be thinking from that fallen human kind of failing perspective that cannot basically see anything but a piece of dirt with a anti-traditional flag, like all basically modern nationalities really are, fixed on it. Right, and you will just engage in a chthonic superstition. So exactly the opposite that your ancestors, if you're so obsessed with them, actually believed in, and that you still want to convince yourself of flipping, right, in order to feel better with yourself, because you perfectly know what the true one actually means. That's the interesting thing about sin, is that there is no such thing like evil in ignorance. Right, there is always a malice behind it, and an actual active will to destroy, like to sin per se. Now, this is interesting because people even in the 13th century really believed this. Admittedly, traditional awareness was pretty low already in the 13th century. In the 13th century, the average person believed that faith was superior to the individual, right? There is no doubt about this. We see it from practically everywhere, right? From what we call feudalism, in a sense, to, I don't know, even in the Norse sagas that were being written down at this point, like the entire all the peoples of the world by now had been given up the traditional idea that they could actually tame and possess fortune, right, to achieve the apotheosis, right? And so when you look at the Mongols instead, you realize at least that, say, that the more primitive the people and the more they were confronted with that state of reality. So as I was saying at the very beginning, it's not that this means that we're particularly better, right, overall, that, let's say, the collective discipline, right, of the world simply was superior per se in a Mongol army, because these peoples were habituated to just live on the run, right, moving with all their herds. And again, we made lots of videos about Mongol warfare, logistics, training in part, like at least lifestyle, etc. The point is what this thing, in fact, is able to accomplish on a broader scale, right? In relative terms, what the Mongols did was impressive, even so in absolute terms. But on the longer run, Mongolia remained Mongolia. The empire basically vanished after essentially a century and a half or so, at the longest, and again, basically surviving mostly on the trunks of the more civilized countries that they had, sanitary civilizations, of course, that they had to conquer. And no doubt that the legacy was massive. That's yet another overlooked dimension in pop culture, like how this, admittedly, in the West we have forgotten, not for the better reasons, right? The fact that, at least in Asia, broadly meant, it's not just about the legend of Genghis Khan, or just the massive oceanic, literal oceanic legacy of this empire that remained, but even, for example, the Alexandrian one, right? Notoriously, the Islamic world remembered much more, much better, right? Much more adequately Alexander's myth, we can say, and it's not an insult here, it's actually the proper concept, an epos, just per se, than the West, right? So there is also that factor to consider, how much, after all, tradition was close, but how not really recognized really was, because fortunately, at least in other countries, we had gone already far enough to at least to afford to lower the guard, and still going on with a civilization that kept, its banner higher than basically any of these took, right, from the steps we're trying to surpass. We've seen it very harshly, like in that video about the let's say it was on the Western accounts on the, I would say, their alleged superiority of Mongol warfare, right? For which you realize that by this very 13th century, like the second half of it, the Mongols were surely a fearsome military machine, but they didn't quite scare anyone, right? In that, with that kind of aura of alleged invincibility that they had at least been recorded, like through certain particular sources, right? We do not quite have the simple, let's say at least the broader, not simple, but let's say the more complex view of, say, the German-Polish, let's say, command at the Battle of Linitz, and like before and after the battle, or at least after for the few that had survived, right? There is something, of course, big there. There's something shocking, but it's not literally the end of the world either. Right, and today I will not digress on the reasons why the Mongols themselves had been outstretching really their capabilities there, and just the way they approached Central Europe there shows you strategically that was just like something substantially different from just like walking into a country and banishing and destroying it and hoping to just seize control of that. They were very cautious in many ways, in spite of the impression, the understandable, even properly emotional impression that they made in the West. And again, I would like to stress that I have an enormous respect for Mongol warfare. Right, I'm not to be an expert, but have ever been interested. It's just strangely enough, not even for the Crusade. And so even though I made, as you know, really a lot of content about the Crusade, but it's one of those topics that I think requires a bit more of proper specialization, given the importance. And I talk about the actual specialization, not having written, again, a master thesis on it, right? I'm talking about something really serious. That can perhaps hardly be dominated even by single PhDs at that level. I can tell you it's really very difficult just to study, through such research, like much narrower, both in time and space, just military realities, not even descending into the say, at least to a satisfactory degree, as much as the military one, the politics or the society of the whole thing. So it's that this is, you understand now why I'm really talking about this aspect, because it's a matter of scale. It's not really a matter, if you're still wondering, about these topics and how they relate, like quantitatively and qualitatively between each other, it means that you still have to get there. That's why at least I've been somewhere around, say here and there, like beyond and just just before, depending on the topic, and so I can at least sense some of this measure, but it's really that complicated and messed up. Let's say that the 13th century in Eastern Europe definitely began with wars, right? May seem like a simplistic thing to say after all just what I stated, but that's literally it, right? The Russian duchies and the Cuman Khanates, first of all, warred with each other, right? And as we've seen, this mechanism had basically gone as far as part of the Cumans even just being settled. Think about the Karabakh among the in Russian territory, interfering a bit as this somewhat less civilized military, capable of at least providing readily available forces that knew how to just fight, because by leading in the steppes, that's mostly how they lead, like to this more already gentrified Russian principalities. And that peak, right, the Kievan Golden Age, especially in the 12th century, had already left space to some kind of weakening. It's not about the broader principality as the name Kievan, that everything remained somewhat autonomous, right? But from the within of all these principalities, to the point that they could have not withstood the Mongol wave, right? I'm not going to discuss even here if the Rus had a chance in that regard, but at least given the political and social premises, and that's always the point. Never make it simple as, the Mongols were the strongest, so they were just walking into places, and there was no war, and battles were just carried out by a bunch of fools who wanted to withstand the Mongol tactics in open ground, and it was just crazy. No, if that had been the case, there would have not been a battle, like as it did happen in many places in the world, where just the local rulers accepted Mongol overlordship, right? Often, of course, in exchange of something, but there was always a very strongly, say, politically and militarily negotiated reality that the local communities had to decide whether to gamble on, right? So the surrounding peoples as well are interesting, as I was saying before. The Russian space was huge, as you know, as relatively scattered and divided by specific forests, waterways, surely also levels of development, right? As we were remembering before, there were other peoples at the outskirts of the Rus that not just would cope with them, but also with the Mongol invasions listed at large, right? For example, the Lithuanians, right, that would actually benefit from the Mongol invasions temporarily, as they managed to, like with the crumbling of the Rus, they expanded into this wide area known as Ruthenia. That, however, in turn was not enough for the Lithuanians to survive autonomously against the Teutonic Knights that were basically the enemy against which they had literally also expanded in Ruthenia to find the actual resources, because they wouldn't have them against the Germans. That's how they allied themselves with the Polish princedoms that were the older enemies, right? The same ones that had called the actual Teutonic Order, right? To install themselves in the country, and then to expand forward against these pagans. But that now was in fact a bit repentant of what how far the Germans had gone, and basically united with the Lithuanians, like to lay the foundations of the later Commonwealth and all this stuff. And Lithuania would interestingly remain properly an Eastern European country, in part because what we called by Lithuania in that sense was what would become the Grand Duchy. I made a video about Lithuania, you should make others that period. So most actually of that land was Ruthenia, was part of the Rus. And this would trigger lots of interesting things, like including how the old Russian Palatinate went to be part of Poland. Made lots of videos about Ukrainian history during the modern era. For that matter, they're really fascinating because they tell you again it speaks volume of how close actually the Rus was before the Mongol invasions to Central Europe, right? And in many ways, the Poles were the ones that would consolidate their position. I made a video about the Europa Jagiellonica, right, for the 15th century. If you go in medieval Poland playlist, you will find plenty of that. It was the one that basically would capitalize the most on this situation. The reason being that, in spite of the fact that the Piast's, say, Polish principality fragmentation was pretty similar to the Russian one. I made a video specifically to observe the similarities between the two systems that at times also kind of switched rulers, and or at least not literally, but say they intervene into one another's sphere of influence, in positive as in negative relations, let's say, were first of all Roman Catholic, which at that point the schism, as you know, had already happened, and they had been closer to civilization in many ways. They had mostly been influenced by German feudalism, or what had by the 13th century finally kicked in right to the same level, say, of England or France. Different ways, like as we observed, probably even Germany, as the broader Central Europe will have great difficulties to take off, right, as a single, as a unitary thing, because you could have entire kingdoms, but if the nobility basically monopolized the royal election, and this is the same thing for Poland, Bohemia, Hungary, and more, like the thing would have gotten really problematic. To this list, I would actually add even Sweden, that was not threatened by the Mongols, but if you realize, like in insight, in perspective, how close, we've seen it in previous videos also about Scandinavian warfare, had been massively, right, influenced by steppes warfare culture, and had even brought it very far, way west, especially in the north, in places like Britain, etc. And Shirley was observing with concern what was happening just across the Baltic. As you know, the southern shores were not really touched by the Mongols. That, yes, basically reduced them to tribute, but didn't venture up there. But occasionally it could have even happened to remind the locals of their previous commitment, let's say. And also Hungary, that surely suffered from that oligarchic problem that we just listed, but actually was to receive one of the hardest blows from the Mongols, but also recover the quickest, basically, of all these countries. Like Poland was invaded by the Mongols twice, by the way. Hungary had a devastating, also military defeats in open ground, all these things. But at the end of the day, they managed to bloom later on, and this is true, generally speaking, for most of Central Europe in inside, or in the same century, especially in the second half of it. But let's say, generally speaking, this threat, like the fact that the Golden Horde later on could even just keep moving and invading and creating trouble around, was significantly impacting all these peoples and influencing their warfare, not just directly, but through, as you know, the avalanche of refugees that began to arrive from the west. The most famous ones being the Cumans themselves, and that will become a normal element, let's say, of Central European landscape in many ways, especially from a military point of view, but also ethnically. Right, these peoples were settled like what the Russians said, like our own pagans, right? As far as the sense that these were differently from the Mongols, at least some Turkic pagans that had been known from centuries in the area. I made a video about the Lipka Tatars that are connected to this phenomenon. There would be royal dynasty, one of Hungary, right, with Cuman blood. At some point, the Hungarian king marries a Cuman princess of these refugees, again, that had been settled, some sort of royal army against the ethnic one of the Hungarian nobility that was too much of a problem to keep together. We find them in great battles like the one of Markfeld. And again, they become really just in the monastic codes, they're stereotyped, even just with that kind of bi-cocked hat, running around, looting, seizing, right? Not even needing to pay them because they were in just for the booty, all this kind of stuff, and so bringing that extra taste to Central Europe. That, admittedly, in the 13th century, we're still seeing, for example, in German battlefields, continuously the migration era Draco standard in use. Yes, there still was, admittedly, the last century which disappears. It would be really redundant at this point to add all the Mongol influences in the art of war, or even just what the Westerners began to catalyze or to absorb or to compact, to develop further, such as plate armor that was in the air already, like in 12th century Hungary. You already find some horse chest plates, of course, Byzantine swords and so on. As we've seen, the steppes had been a bit more of that, was the so-called Polish belt, already organic material that basically has the same abdominal kind of, in fact, a belt, let's say, abdominal band function that is the same structure that the plate armor will be sewn on, right, as you see mostly from the Alp frontier. But that had just to happen, because in a few years it's all over Europe already. In a few decades, that's the future of European armor, and it wasn't triggered like by the Mongols or the steppe peoples. Would have developed anyways, just like the Renaissance wasn't triggered by a bunch of Byzantine manuscripts, for that matter. But people sometimes, again, tends to make things cheap, easy, and superficial, and as I was saying before, that's actually not history, even in the first place. Speaking of the Caucasus that we've seen in the steppes, Eurasian Steppes Warfare series, a similar state of affairs prevailed, in as much as political fragmentation, just properly the Mongol invasion, and in that country especially a easier permeability overall, also in a broader cultural sense, because that had always been the case since the time of the Iranians, of the Turks, of like Persian influence, Mongol influence, Byzantine influence, and so on, and just the local cultures being, aside from the properly original native traits, some kind of also of consequence, in a way. So the political map of these countries would be significantly modified, right? At least in a way that reflected the shock that had occurred through this massive Mongolian punch, right? In Central Asia and Mongolia, as well as southern Siberia, the picture was altered, right? Not just because of the Mongol Empire that naturally emerged at this point as probably the one of the Kagan Temujin, better known as Genghis Khan. There were movements such as, for example, the emergence of the same Mongol empires, had been consolidating since the 12th century, making their first moves, etc. It was the Khwarezmian Empire that at some point was also invested by the Mongols. It brought to, say, as you know, even a relative diaspora of this people, essentially mixing the older Iranian and Turkic traditions to a very high level of equestrian, also traditional religion. It would arrive to destroy Jerusalem, just, however, at that point, more as not maybe probably a band of martyrs, but surely of desperados, considering what had happened to their country. We remember the name of Shah Muhammad. That was really, quite of a figure. So again, I never made, I think, a video about the Khwarezmians, except in that one, say those notions in the video on medieval Islamic military music. We will again look at the towering Chinese empire in the Far East that, at least before the Mongol onslaught, seemed invincible. That's yet another thing that we should reflect on, right? The difference, I talked about it here and there in my videos, but say the difference of how between China and Europe, even between these two centuries empires, and how they had come to be, right? I talk about Europe as an empire because technically it really was, right? At least as, in spite of the political fragmentation, was actually not much greater than the same Chinese one that was also relying on, again, very different social systems, right? But mostly the more open sense of the empire. In fact, that China had always been feeling a sort of universe on its own, whereas the Europeans were already, say, we were not particularly impressed even by what happened later with the Mongol Empire. Like, we made a video about the travelers at the time. It was an astonishing civilizational intelligence to describe, to note a lot, not to judge, just to note, and not even to be amazed, right, by all the mirabilia that were still, again, noted along the way. Even the massive amount of Europeans that went to China during the 13th century, even to stay at a point when the system essentially cut the Pax Mongolica, right? The transcontinental route at least didn't render it favorable to simply come back or to maintain contacts, right? For those who had remained, the Christians who had remained in China, for example. So just by this degree, you understand how far and wide Mongol warfare impacted the cultures of these peoples. I made a video specifically about, I think it was Eastern Eurasian warfare between the 11th and the mid-14th and mid-11th, mid-14th century, which illustrates this in detail. That is to say, looking at mostly, in fact, Eastern Eurasia, not even specifically China as such, but properly the well, Eastern Eurasia is basically Asia, right? But there are other people scattered around, like in the broader steppes space, that we have seen being quite different at times in the level of development. Right, when we talk about the Mongols, we always think, oh my god, they had stolen. That's the same thing like with the Romans, where they had just taken weapons from other people, right? And so they were succeeding because, no, not at all, right? If you look at Mongol weaponry, most of the times was incredibly primitive and archaic, right? And there were peoples in the heart of the steppes that you wouldn't suspect having anything particularly advanced, that at some point, despite being wiped out by the Mongols, were actually particularly advanced from a technological point of view and had hell of local arms and armor production that models of the same Mongols adopted, and those are peoples whose names we don't even remember. There is a further spread of certain types of, or the reinforcements of certain type of fighting techniques or tendencies, whatever you want to call them. Also, opologically, perhaps is not so correct, but the further spread of the autocratic model does correspond to also a lighter dimension of the average horseman, right? As we've seen just recently with the Khazar Empire, the time of the Turkic steppes dominance had spent itself. Already looking at the Kumans, you realize that even the end of the Khaganates, at least the Turkic ones as such, the fact that it's like after a big wave right in the sea, that after that there is a lot of twirls of different currents, mullinels, etc. But the main wave, right, has now gone. It's also been broken, and then some bigger one, right, arrives gathering further forces, but the ultimate energy of this broader space is to end, right? The Mongol Empire basically ends in the 14th century as a unitary thing, just a couple of centuries away from basically the western dominance of the steppe with pike and shot, and basically the taking over of Siberia by the Russians, and that's basically it, right? Yes, there are powerful peoples, like it's still in Central Asia, that of course are not rich, whatever, they fight with the Chinese, that until the 18th century have objectively the largest military forces available in enormous campaigns, always more or less also always in the same regions that they had been fighting constantly, this nomads that always reformed even after being crushed. So there is something really anthropological even in the ways great empires were shaped by the nature and the different exposure, let's say, to nomadic warfare. Right? I think Europe was much more tempered. It was paradoxically, even though it seems like there is not a major obstacle like in between or a great Chinese wall, whatever, it doesn't matter. Like Europe is much more like, again, like the wave has to disperse itself on a much wider amount of terrain before it even gets to the places that are able to give some headache even to the entire compact force if it had been readily available just there. So as I said, as Westerners, I think we constantly underestimate ourselves and the value of civilization, and especially the Western one, especially in comparison with China, and how they dealt with the steppe peoples and how they dealt with the rest of the world. In a way, Europe was taking over the literal world, except for China herself, admittedly, and even there, like, it would technically happen, at least, with a giant, a Neolithic giant, more or less like the Ottomans, like the Russians, etc. Like, there would be always, again, the paradigm that I was talking about before, that you can't even brutally and autocratically trying to maintain something together, but that's not how internally you're going to consolidate an actual power. And there is a reason if the Westerners narrowly meant took over the world and still got it, even though you would like, as haters there not to be the case because you're simply jealous of other people's accomplishments, including your own, right? At least the people within your own world that you want to sabotage, so that, if you do not succeed personally, everybody has to go down with you. Well, historically, I just tell you that what happens is that you actually go down. Who's at the top remains at the top. Maybe in kind of a worse world, but still at the top. And even the later revolutions are usually not like, especially in the more advanced places, not the terrible things that happen in other much less equilibrated empires, countries, cultures, or wherever you want to put the accent on, right? So it's difficult. Sometimes I don't want to sound too psychologistic or emotionalistic, but the question of the pain, right? The sense that all these conquests were wiping out substantial portions of the entire global population. And this has been attentively calculated for Genghis Khan's empire properly. It's something that leaves a deep mark, right? For most of us, fortunately, are just statistics like that, like the cute little funny guy named, at least nicknamed Stalin, was talking about. But it's real, very much for those who actually witnessed that, not just one death as a tragedy, but literally maybe entire, peoples literally wiped out in front of your eyes, which was observed by at least the few ones who could survive to those massacres were not genocides, right? So what happened? Like, it's difficult. I'm not a fan of the term genocide because I think it's abused historically, and pretty much like what I would be criticized being mainstream for it and all this BS. But actually, especially as far as ancient and medieval warfare is concerned, the entire notion of genocide is quite problematic, to say the least. To put forth, genocides are not just lots of people being killed. It's properly why you killed them. And I think that the Mongol conquests fit surely one of the single most traumatically violent, brutal, and unspeakable chapters in the entire history of mankind. But they were also marked, in fact, if properly studied politically and strategically, by an incredibly kind of steel logic, right? That surely in the first years of the conquest was marked by Mongolian primitiveness as a culture and as a people. There is no doubt about that. But that exactly because of that was still calculated, in as much they knew they didn't have yet the cultural capacity to maintain exactly all they could reach and destroy. Right, another little thing that happened, right, just in case you forgot, the destruction of Baghdad. Right, I don't know, like, this is not about, like, the Muslims or whomever, like, you can make comparisons. Just imagine the actual destruction of Rome, like, not, the many but contained sacks of the city that kept on kind of, maintaining her premises in the West. Here we're talking about the literal destruction. Right, the scientific, willing, active demolition of the city and the extermination of its population. Right, there is barely anything, as you know, about Abbasid Baghdad still standing. Right, and there is this is yet another feature of the steppes, and sometimes also the Islamic world. That before we were remembering Eastern Europe, Central Europe, as far as the sense of, again, the openness to the steppes, because there is hardly even just a geographic boundary that surely something means, even though geopolitics, of course, does not exist, despite of the best efforts of strategically literate people to pretend that that's an actual thing. That the Islamic world had been brutally exposed to the nomadic world, to actually say, and not talking even just about the Islamic world, but even properly the region of the near the Middle East, to nomadic raids, sacks, destruction, etc. for millennia. We've seen it well in these Eurasian steppes warfare series, and this is notorious. Like since Scythian times, this thing was going on and on and on. And he wouldn't stop, right? And this should make you reflect about how cultures are eventually molded by this, right? How many characters of Islam, for example, are, or how Islam developed in the first place, connected with this, right? So aside that, I don't know, the Islamic Jihad is the pure identical copy of the Indo-Aryan Persian Holy War, right? That all the Indo-Europeans believe in, right? So the entire universal one existed around. Just a little note, and of course that an Islamic caliphate was basically designed over either a Roma or a Sasanian, power. But the gulags, the sense of instability of power, in fact, the much greater fragmentation of the Islamic world compared to the Christian one. I mean, there is no comparison about that. Just in a spiritual sense, of course, there is a big difference there that the Muslims didn't have a church, didn't have a priesthood, right? They condensated everything into the ruling, like into the leadership. There was only one, right? So they could also spend themselves like conquering everything from the Atlantic to the Indus in one shot, but eventually fragmenting themselves in a hopeless way, and having basically the most unitary thing ever being built over, surprise, surprise, Constantinople, right? So definitely not, in the sense, at least by a degree, an Eastern power, but So these perspectives are crucial because if it blows your mind to think about this massive divide, you can just imagine what the ones that existed between, say, Christian or Islamic culture, at least religiously wide, or somehow cousins with the Jewish world and so on, and the steppe, right? Steppe in which these religions, by the way, arrived by a degree, and that, as we've said, we're always lurking at the light, not at the shadows, right? It was the civilization looked at the shadows out there of the steppes, but from the steppes, that darkness looked into civilization. A bit of a Nietzschean sense of look at your own monsters, your own deal, like and as we were saying before, that mystical connection, for which, of course, all the sedentary peoples knew perfectly that their powers had been established up once upon a time by some sort of, at least of offspring of a nomadic power, namely, Europe. We still speak, not all, but still Indo-European languages. There is a specific reason for, and so culturally, the idea of the knight, of the steppe, say of the little chivalric culture of the equestrian symbol, the heavenly horses, of the sense of individual heroism that we're seeing is very appealing to the instinctive dimension, made also some of the greatest sedentary civilizations flourish because they wouldn't forget tradition while being modern and managing to combine the two things, because if you pick either one of the two, you don't really get anywhere as an actual ecumenic power, which is the only purpose at the end of the day of both modernity and tradition at the same time. I don't believe modernity actually exists. I will be true about that, but that's also not for this video to comment, but at least what we conventionally call modernity, which is also largely the same tradition at the end of the day, albeit, with us running short of that, and so coming up with lots of BS that has, in fact, nothing to do with tradition, but to which an alternative does not really exist, because there is not anything outside tradition, right? If you believe, at least in objective reality and universal values, there is no such thing. There is just, like, at best, a readaptation to the circumstances through on a traditional basis that you still have to know how to wield, which is the entire problem at the end of the entire challenge of tradition herself. So, going back a bit to the most conventional aspects of this series, like, what do we see at least in the Rus, right? Before the Mongol conquest, right? For one side, we see that the set of war gear was getting heavier, right? As we were saying before, the mercantile estates were being somewhat eroded. The peasantry was also just in Eastern. Again, mostly the Russian centers had emerged on an intercontinental trade base, and the Eastern European countrysides had not been particularly florid in a comparative sense, like the rest of the continent. Some areas were admittedly quite fertile, but I'm talking about the actual distribution of wealth and how, generally speaking, the majority of the land also was in terms of output. Well, definitely not so that there was not really much of a popular force that could be simply co-opted, like, I don't know, in communal Europe, right, with really a very strong, courageous consolidation of city-states or something. The princes began to take over, right, and also the countryside as such. So there was surely, as we've seen in the previous video about the Russian equipment in the 12th century, actually a massive Western influence. That's yet, as I was saying before, overlooked, right? Properly Western-style weapons. There was still a lot of Turkic stuff around, were typically Slavic weapons, and this heavier arms and armor naturally were ever more functional. We look at the elites, of course, but massive maces are typical of the Kievan area. This tells you probably how powerful local elites really were, right? To be again loaded in metal, weighing I don't know how much athleticism really required to have that kind of warfare in which, as we've seen, the steppes bias still made these guys horse archers, right? Even in the case of the heavy nobility, something that in the West you don't really see, even though they all knew how to use a bow on horseback. If anything, they would go hunting on a regular basis with that. But in a very different way, when this is actually combined, like synergically, with lots of other weapons, and receiving all these influences. In fact, what we see even just in the beautiful Russian icons or things like that is a lot of Byzantine canon that surely is there, also archaeologically in part, but largely is not quite there, right? Russian knights didn't look like 5th or 6th century Christian military saints, right? They were something else. But as you know, Byzantine culture, so as it had been adopted also by the Rus, was so standard and inflexible and unchanging that even this actually probably didn't help excessively the in rigidity, like the coping with this broader threat and saying, developing something that wasn't now modeled on the autocratic Byzantine model of an empire, and now had even been crushed, as you know, during the Fourth Crusade, and that had basically showed how the West had won at that point by the 13th century in anything, right? From the 12th, right, already, again, any basically military technology was now topped by the West. And again, it's not all, but it's just a mean to an end, right? There is a moral capacity to wield that unitly the Byzantine Empire couldn't withstand and simply collapsed. It's a matter of ideas, right? Great empires collapse because of ideas, not much because of weapons per se. So, if the Mongols, I'm not a fan of what ifs by any stretch of the imagination, but if, say, let's assume that the Mongols would have not, like Genghis Khan died, and some other, some idiot at that point would have just come in his place, and there would have not been all this drive. The Mongols would have started killing each other again, cyclically, etc. This thing had not happened. Probably the Russian panoply would have evolved towards a more kind of Western kind of a direction. That's because probably the West would have had just much more, well, it's difficult to tell in that sense. In any case, it would have, especially after the end of the Byzantine Empire, and with still a unitary Rus not crushed by the, it's a unit, big word, but let's say a Rus not crushed by the Mongol wave, and acting at least from a single principalities in a more orderly way than they would do later, because at this point, after the Mongol invasion, they were starting to actually say to the Pope, okay, let's convert to Roman Catholicism, because it would, and it did happen for some Russian areas, but say from a condition again that was difficult even for the Westerns with the Mongols around to intervene in. As you know, there was always this plan of launching a crusade in the east, even in the places the Golden Horde would have basically maintained his oil fields as far as the pasture for nomadic horsemen, right, were located. But it would never happen. Cleverly, probably, because at that point there wasn't much of a threat in the first place. The Mongols were becoming just like part of the broader game. As you know, the Christians allied themselves with the Mongols, trying to convert them and to fight together against the Muslims, both sides, and so on. There are a lot of interesting things going on. But especially the mid 14th century crisis bringing all this to an abrupt end, for the few that had even started, at least wars, right, to happen. Except we do find lots of Western mercenaries in places like Ilkhanate Persia, right, in the Persian Gulf. Frankish knights, Italian marines, or things like that, which make it. These were the same Mongols hiring them, so it's actually very eloquent as far as we were talking about the actual military quality of properly the Mongol. It's a big question to answer. What had this really been like? Because again, even in terms of documentation, we don't know that much. We don't know much about Mongol armies in the first place. And the more we know about them, frankly, and the more we see how primitive they were. Like again, if we're talking about the Chinese or the Persians, that's what basically the Mongols become in those regions, right? So it's another thing. But again, the first waves, the actual steppes peoples, were as effective as they were primitive. And when I say primitive, doesn't necessarily mean underdeveloped or anything of that kind. It means simply that they were using a much more ethnic, in other words, what they already had by default. Because, as I said before, in fact, the technology is not everything. You can't even bring with you to Europe Chinese crews, engineers, whatever, but you're still a nomadic, it's a Central Asian military machine, right? You're not a copy of a Chinese army, right, crossing the steppes. It doesn't work like that, and that's what the Mongols really remained throughout all this time, and also informing, in fact, the nature of many other powers. Think about the Timurid Empire and how it would profile itself. It is fundamentally a still, in that sense, a Central Asian power, even if it's based eventually in the Middle East. And again, the cycle continues because it's a bit like the Mamluks. It's easier in a sense to have this perennial injection of, say, in fact, in that case, military, say, slave soldiers, put in this way, and putting down the revolts of those you have settled and have got it greedier and kind of unloyal by hiring other or buying other slave soldiers, right? That's quite understandable. And this was going on, as you know, with the Gulams, etc., from quite a long time, arguably ever since the birth of the Caliphate, because those are the same centuries of the Turkic waves, even before. It would be interesting to see where that slave soldiery actually begins. I wouldn't be surprised if the Byzantines had something similar in the very centuries of the migration, even with the Huns and other peoples. But again, also the steps changes over time. It's not always the same, and not just on a simply ethnic basis. Lots of things crossing my mind right now, but we can't digress on all of them. What we see, however, about the Russian panoplies, that before the Mongol invasions, swords became narrower, battle axes heavier, spearheads even more massive than the ones they were. These are really quite powerful indicators of anti-armor use, right? So sort of stocks and smashing traumatic weapons, just things that really punch pretty darn hard, and whenever they can, they manage to properly smash armor as much as you can on a massive impact. In mounted combat, that we can understand that the physical forces involved are, beyond what, far beyond what takes to render a human body physically inconsistent, right, at the impact, right? So never underestimate what it means to fight on horseback, what it actually means to fight on horseback, right? Your body it's just designed for resisting some kilometers an hour impacts, right? As I always say, if you sum the speeds of the two horsemen, you impact someone at 90 kilometers per hour. Well, there are a lot of interesting pictures of accidents on the road where you can't see what actually happens. Where just imagine that having to brake en masse, right? That was again the same concept. Collective training to punch hard and break entire formations, and not avoiding impact, because cavalry always impact in the most solidly brutal ways that you can imagine, but at least reducing that to a minimum, so letting all the rest, let's say the other guys being properly disordered beyond repair and starting to flee, and your forces instead remaining compact and just pushing through, and at that point massacring as many people as you can. Now, judging from that mix we remember before our archaeological finds and pictorial evidence, the Russian men-at-arms of the 13th century wore mail and armor made of plates, interestingly enough, either sewn to a leather or cloth base, or else attached to each by the thongs. The result was really impressive, because there were solutions that were substantially different from plate armor as we see it in Western Europe spreading. At the same time, suggesting compared again to the sanitary peoples, mostly the need also of greater, perhaps a bit of a more individualistic flexibility, and the need of protecting yourself mostly from missile fire, right? In a much more uniform way that basically a Western knight would expect on a regular basis, right? That's why protecting the flanks, which were evidently the objective also in part of this double envelopment by the side of the Mongols when they refused the centers and they opened the wings, right? Let's say they opened the first battle line, defining on the wings, and then falling back on you when the center, was at least the last line was reached by the enemy, and closing on them altogether, right? We could make, not just around these guys, but also expose them initially to a hell of a fire from the sides, from the flank. That's the reason why plate armor starts developing consistently, because you realize it's designed to protect some areas that normally before, at least more, right, of the ones that would before mostly be protected by the frontality of the attack per se, right, in the thickly packed order. Actually, it's a superficial explanation. It's not really that, because there was a symmetry already in the development of armor and so on. But let's say the necessity of having even more, let's say, the flanks even better protected starts to appear. In a sense, otherwise there would have been slightly different solutions, more breastplates, or even in the back, or things like that. Instead, here it's an all-around kind of defense. This Russian men-at-arms would also wear mail sollerets of a type borrowed from Europe. That is a protective covering for the foot consisting of riveted plates of armor. This being necessary again for many other reasons. Generally speaking, you can see, starting from 13th and 14th century, the substantial weighing and acceleration, in fact, in such process of arms and armor. Like, what is the actual cause? Is it the infantry that is getting at some point stronger? At this point, yes, in the Rus, you would have, again, as we were saying before, like the lower classes being broken further, but there still were, right, more effective anti-cavalry weapons around crossbows, etc. I made a video about, I think, the 13th, 14th century Russian militias, right? So nothing dramatic, but especially number, but at least certain units of professionals, right, appearing substantially armored, as we've seen this, the halberds, things like that, like double-hand swords that also, right, towards the end of the century, by the way, but I was talking about pole arms, actually were all something you had to be wary of, especially at the end of a charge, like when you enter into these guys, right? So, but say I'm much more inclined to think that these protection even for foot could happen because of the dramatic, again, missile firepower put up by Mongols, and even the increase in, again, the shock capacity in a cavalry charge. Like, you want it to be well protected all around, because really different things can go wrong. Can be debris, splintered, whatever, everything can go wrong. Even just for a millimeter, you can essentially be knocked out for good, say, and you don't want that to happen. Interestingly enough, again, this gear is taken from Western Europe, right? So all stuff that just they had in common, but more specifically was being now properly brought from the west to the east in ever larger numbers. This is something similar to what we have seen, for example, in the video about the 14th century Byzantine horde cavalrymen. Heavy cavalrymen, like there is a lot of, of course, of Frankish stuff. Now, properly investing the same spring of Byzantineness that the Russians had been drinking from, right? So that's obvious, right? They would get all this stuff from now the most advanced arms and armor producers who were in the West, by far, by the way, both in quantity and quality, which we tend to overlook as well. But I will make probably a video soon about that specific aspect. From the late 12th century onwards, helmets with masks or half masks in the shape of a human face came into vogue, both in Europe and in Asia. And the Russian warriors took up this fashion. And this seemingly was instead a Mongol borrowing. We see the the Kumans, famously enough, in their graves, this kind of displaying this kind of masked helmets that are somehow typical, but the Kipchaks, but in that sense, it was a bit of a Mongol legacy, and that's stemmed, by the way, from the same need of the Mongols actually to, especially the Mongol elite, and again we're talking more or less, as you understand here, always of the elite because it has most complete panoply to observe, and the less is just less of that. Necessitate this greater protection for frontal impact, right? For frontal clashes, and so a bit like in Europe, like with the great helm and the full enclosing, right, of the face, like the narrow eye slits, right? Even aside from some other, feature there, like a great difficulty even for breathing, right? And so for just wearing that at the last moment, preferably at least, if other stuff was not raining in the meanwhile, that in these spaces is exactly what is going on, that you would wear to at the last moment, right, just to save breath. Here in the steppes, admittedly, it's slightly different. You would have mostly these they're not fully enclosed helmets, right? They're literally caps, like they had been existing like in the steppes substantially at this point. Especially the Kipchak style helmet of the 13th century has a very pointy, let's say, shape with like probably the purpose, especially of parrying the massive saber blows of at least the largest sabers that were often used by the Mongols, by themselves, by the way, and to which the mask is attached frontally, which means that as far as your chin is, your chin could be protected substantially, but I mean beyond that, your neck often, unless there was some camel or some other type of armor attached, you would have mostly like we would be mostly open, so you could breathe, right? And this tells you also how in the steppes, like overall, the elite was lighter, right? At least in relative terms to the numbers, because at least the ultra elite of the steppes had massively heavy things, like they could enclose themselves in very thick. It depends also on how you make mail in this context, right? As far as how much you want to be closed, even with this mask or the cam mail and so on. But the level of de facto standard now armor that is extending to every knight involved, especially from the late 13th century in Europe, is the measure of how heavier, generally speaking, European cavalry really had become, and how, let's say, more the sense, not just affluent in a sense of even availability of relatively heavier equipment. It was just for, we will see it in the 14th century, a commoner could, for example, easily buy a sword, right? But how also more standardized, like collectively drilled, the thickly packed couche lengths kind of cavalry chargers really were. And in fact, at this point, the European battle lines are ever larger, right? They just augment not just the heaviness of the troops, but they augment properly the number of knights. This in part occurs because also among the Mongols, because Again, they're the leaders. They accumulate a lot of wealth. They also access, as we were saying before, much better, much greater wealth overall to the one they had, say, enjoyed. Let's put it this way, in the steppes. But the sense still is that their cavalry operates together with much lighter one on average than the Westerners, who and also in absolute terms, kind of less number of entirely heavy cavalry just for single battle lines than Westerners. Right, in relative terms, it doesn't mean again that the Westerners would always succeed at all, but we lack also, in fact, we lack comparatively what happened in the later centuries, in as much as just the update, the advancements of Western warfare compared to the Mongol gentrification were concerned, were going on. So that can't be simply ignored, or let's say not taken into account. Because again, my impression from studying Mongol warfare is at least that as far as the capacities again of a threat in Europe, all these kind of things, and the entire warfare per se, we have, I think, overrated them. And I'm serious, really, in everything about this. I mean, I don't mean it to again pretend that there was something particularly wrong about the war at all. Right? It was no doubt one of the greatest military machines in the history of mankind. But again, how would they operate against certain specific objectives? We will never know, because again, they withdrew from Europe after, and not simply for political reasons, but literally because they tried that campaign, and then eventually, instead of trying the next other times, at some point they came back for political reasons. But because of in fact this very uncertainty, the fact that they had stopped themselves to that point compared to how they would normally operate or going on, and that's something which they hadn't been doing against, especially at that point, such an advanced country. Right, China, they had taken it over. Europe, they waited for that. Admittedly, that if Mongolia had been in Western Eurasia rather than in Eastern Eurasia, they may have been able to conquer it. May have had much greater chance, at least, to confront themselves, to settle more, to influence more. That wasn't the case. That must be taken into account. And even there, you would question what is exactly they could do and why they didn't practically operate in the same way. Again, Europe and China are very different, right? Don't let yourself be fooled again also this kind of philo-orientalism. But the Chinese were more advanced. We do not technically know if they were more advanced. Like having this technology or another doesn't actually mean that you can employ it always in the same, or that you would have the chance, or that you would always be better at it, right? So this example, even just of the human face masks coming into vogue both in Europe and in Asia at the same time, it tells you how much more leveled than we think these cultures really were. So even technically, right? And so that's not really what you have to look at to explain what actually happened. The Mongol army gained, needless to say, innumerable victories, and in half of a century ensured the rule of the descendants of Genghis Khan, right, in the greater part of Eurasia. On this there is no doubt as well. Their tactics and strategy were definitely sophisticated. They used this advanced engines of war that mostly mutated from the Chinese, but if you actually look at the Karakitai, for example, 12th century Mongol warfare, you realize that these, at least the ones of Genghis Khan, maybe they were more primitive, but especially the ones that had been inhabiting closer to China, were sometimes really something, like even in terms of infantry warfare, which is basically what you do not see among the Mongols for normally, like at least in the crossing the steppes for obvious reasons, but also because they truly were counting on a different type of government than one of the sedentary places, even when they controlled them, because their deterrent was based still on that kind of mobility and that kind of lifestyle of the steppes that was really could not be substituted for holding an empire like this with something sedentary. It wouldn't work. Reflect on this too. In fact, again, the Mongol host constituted exclusively of horse, heavy and light. The warriors all used their powerful bows to great effect. Right? Consider just 60 kilos or more of tension force, right, in order to draw it. So massive power, massive missile capacity that really brought for the largest Mongol armies easily hundreds of thousands, if not more than 1 million arrows being shot in a single day, right? And just consider the logistics of it all. We've seen it, but that's not counting the horses. They are by far the single most impacting, say, factor in Mongol warfare, and not just for the better, right? Because if you move with herds of hundreds of thousands of horses, and plus the men and all the baggage, the supplies, and so on, there are some places you just cannot cross, if not in particular times of the year during the cold season when there is enough water, because you have to calculate in advance all the pastures capacity, because there is literally a mathematical equation how much space extensionally like an army like this can consume as far as grass is concerned, and horses have to eat just very specific ways. They're very resilient animals, especially these beasts from Central Asia had been selected exactly for even going up and down this, mountains of, multiple thousands of kilometers in height in some of the most horrifying weathers on the globe, and that had hell resistance, but they were also delicate as far as physical damage, especially from trauma, was concerned. Not that that was the first concern, like in battle, right? Sometimes the Mongols won because they literally shielded themselves from enemy fire behind their own horses. Poor beasts. Allegedly, like at least, admittedly, they had lots to spare. Even tents, depending on, perhaps not always, because that was, say, definitely a luxury in certain circumstances. But this is not to say that the Mongols always had the upper hand just so easily. Had to fight for it, and quite dramatically at some point. Victory was never certain for anyone. Like, otherwise, again, you do not fight a war. Doesn't make any sense, right? That's why wars are fought, because there is a chance to win for both sides. So the arrowheads, as we've seen, were different in size and shape. There were lots of them. There wasn't, as I was saying before, much of a standardization. Most of Mongol arms and armor was incredibly primitive. They had, as we'll see now, especially with armor, they had a lot of fantasy. That the Westerners were quite interested in Mongol armor more than else, because it was probably so empirically put together after that, centuries of nightmarish experience in the Central Asia, that it just worked. Probably the same Mongols didn't know the exact how to rationalize the exact formula of it, but they just knew what worked and knew how to do it, and just go with it, right? So that's something that would turn out at some point even not so effective even against Western armor. But the first shot, as far as this was combined with the entire military machine, the art of war, that evidently these people was the only one to wage in such a fashion at that point, was enough. That's what mostly works in war, like not the best, but the good enough. So we will not just digress on the types of arrows and all the dramatic variety that you can find archaeologically throughout all the Mongol era across the steppe. Like it's ridiculous. We will hopefully see it on another occasion. Of course, that's a bit the forgotten point of Mongol warfare. Of course, that there is as much as a missile component, also a shock one. Otherwise, just have light cavalry, you cannot hold the ground. The Mongols were equipped with spears, with a hook on the socket, which is just a hell of a fencing. Right, the Chinese halberd at some point among the Karakita, you have seen it in the video about their warfare, was used even on horseback by the same Chinese. So that requires a hell of a training individually. At least it is shocking, right, in many ways, and you can literally hook the enemy, take it down, chop down. It's also an interesting anti-cavalry weapon on foot, right, because you can cut, smash, pierce the horse. You find also among the Mongols battle axes, very often maces, suggesting that at least among the victors there was a lot of armor around. The Mongols were not even many in quantitatively speaking. They were often outnumbered actually against their opponents. So the chronicles of some eras are a bit exaggerated to say, oh my god, this horde appeared from, but actually the Mongols had stringent logistic problems, so they would have a very delicate balance to maintain as far even as just this armor was concerned, which evidently was already a lot for them. It was very important because, again, the sedentary world, we've seen it in the other series, had a lot of missile power. Right, and this thing, even the crossbow would scare away the steppe horsemen on the longer run. We'll see it better now for the 14th, 15th century, even before gunpowder. That was already around at this point, as you know. But the balance was also about the number, right? Moving such large amounts, as we've seen, of people and horses across the steppes was extremely delicate. It was not just about the mere problem of pasture, right? It was this army was sent in enemy territory. There were very specific strategic threats to cope with, so you couldn't have too much large armies. Right? You had to have small, compact forces, well-equipped, well-trained ones, right? The Mongol discipline was fierce because of the sheer practice that this nomadic peoples really had been topping, again, empirically, because it wasn't like it would fight all the time. They knew how to do it, but again, you don't need a manual, right, to do that. You just do it, right? This is still valid for the West at this point. Like military treaties are just barely appearing, right? Aside from the mostly Vegetius, that is the only thing read in the West of that type. And it's not because of that the Westerners were also skyrocketing, militarily speaking. For the time, standards, of course, very gradual changes for everyone involved here. There is more about the mace in warfare in general, the sense of the baton of command and the anti-armor weapon par excellence, also the hero that goes unarmored to smash the enemy opponents or to pull their horses' tails, just to prove that they are fit for entering the higher level of heavenly warriors as an initiatory test, let's say. But it's also because there was a lot of armor around. And again, among the sedentaries, never forget about this. It is true that this was primarily designed for anti-Mongol warfare. Every single warfare is designed primarily against your own kind, right? Then, however, this comes very useful, and we don't have reliable statistics about the degree of armoredness of the Mongols, right? It wasn't probably very different from the ones of other peoples, but again, we've seen how the steppes historically react, basically, especially in some of the most ingenious and innovative type of armor that they make themselves as a reaction, however, to the power of the steppes, of the sanitaries that hammer hard as well, right? So there's nothing to kid about, and that's what makes this clash mostly a moral issue, for which the Mongols were at some point morally superior to achieve what they did over the sedentaries, to a degree that, however, wouldn't make it to break them. So that's the entire point of civilization. At least not to break them in a sense of wiping them literally out, right? The single cultures, the single regions, the single polities would de facto remain. At least some were wiped out. This is true as well. But in the broader civilization, in the single Europe, Islam, China, this at best you could substitute yourself to some of these, the regions who made them up, but not more than that. And it's really a deeply felt limit. As we've seen in all these series, the steppes are really the boundary with a different world. It cannot be denied. It cannot be like there is properly a design. Again, it's not just about the environment. These armies are capable of fighting anywhere, and the Mongols show that beautifully. But it's not a matter of it's also where the bases, again, the oil fields, to use a World War II analogy, really are. The Mongol ones are in the steppes. They can't be somewhere else unless the Mongols become something else, and not the Mongols anymore. Even as a steppe people that fights as a steppe people. That's the reason, like, to make the long story short, why the Mongols couldn't conquer Europe. Could at best, occupy some areas where some broader countries were habituated to a narrower elite at some point, just for most of the system to be even less changed, right? How much did the Mongols influence China in a way, right? Probably definitely a lot, but how much did the Chinese influence the Mongols, right? And those who remained in China were, at that point, yes, Mongols, but de facto, right, they were culturally Chinese after really few, and especially that few that took for the empire to split on those regional bases. So the defensive armor of the Mongols carried on Central Asian traditions. Yet in many ways it was more original, for sure. All this punching force had developed a new function. The Mongolian corselets, as we were saying before, were of different varieties, different material. Again, it's that base, like they could adapt to different needs. They're known as the kuyaks, right? Could be made of iron, steel, and sometimes bronze, often of leather, for that matter. Thick and hard as plywood, though, right? So that's what they cared about the most. They had a few vulnerable spots that the Europeans would be quick to find out, as much as they had their own. So nothing. It was impressive, as I said before at the beginning, but it's not all, right? It's not even the majority. It's not even the most important thing by far. So quite often, this all came in a single suit of armor, right? So and together with different systems of armoring combined, and that's the reason why today I keep it short and I do not digress on the differences, because it's also a matter of where you are, where you get this armor from, including from the subject peoples and the ones that you are taming looting the stores of, and so it goes on and on. The Mongols had a hell of artillery system, siege warfare going on, and this is also something that they traditionally didn't have in the steppes, so they were quick to get from other places, right? So this is yet another proof of the fact that it's not a negative thing. On the contrary, it means that they were, for the capacity of employing it, at the same level of those cultures from which they had taken it from. All right, this is always the case with technology, right? Differently, it is actually with different types of other weapons, actually, that you do not see, you do not compare perhaps very much around, but the crossbow again was pretty impressive, right? The crossbow scared the Mongols, we know that, and you say, why? Well, because it's all about doctrine. The Mongols wouldn't have the chance of employing it in the same way the Europeans would, and it's not that they wouldn't even use it, also because they got Westerners in their pay, but because they needed a specific context, such as being sedentarized enough, or being close to those supplies, or having enough peoples that were already equipped with that, or capable of fighting, even just being, say, having the chance to fight on foot. And so at that point, as you understand, you can have that in the Ilkhanate. Surely cavalry is decisive, but infantry is needed to a degree that in the steppes is unseen. You understand where I'm going with this. This is the entire point of the critique of Mongol warfare. It's not a precondition, a preconception. It's really the degree by which they could opt to move towards, and that they wouldn't, because it wasn't even all what they needed, right? What they needed was to have just this well-oiled steppes military system, relying on, again, herds of horses with their owners, moving with their entire possessions, and having that kind of hunger, having that kind of desperation to a degree. It's told very clearly to the King of France, right? They just think that if your peasants, said an ambassador, say an informer, was sent to spy on the Mongols, had the guts, so we're talking about your subjects as French peasants, to eat only what a great Khan eats on a regular basis in Mongol traditional cuisine, you would have those peasants of yours, as the King of France, taking over the world, just like the Mongols would. Right, so that is the most eloquent answer why the system was so successful. There is no technical formula to it. There is a much broader one which occurs in as much as it's rooted in mostly the moral dimension of this culture, not in which kind of weapon, which not. Doesn't matter how impressive these are or how important these are, they are just marginal after all, right? And again, we could go on and on, because this topic is really interesting. It's plenty of interesting quotes, etc. But aside from the fact that I don't have all the time in the world, even though you probably don't think so at this point, it's also better to go step by step, more orderly, and so we will see all this stuff at some other point in depth. And again, this Eurasian steppes warfare videos are merely introductory, right? So you know really how this works. For today, I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. And as always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time. See you next time. Bye.